4:30, so I think I will just start, and then people can come in when they want. Welcome to this short webinar, everyone, and I am delighted to see so many signing up, at least for the webinar. We'll see how many who's going to tune in actually for today's talk. And the interest that I think it seems like it's quite a big interest in this topic based on the number of people who've signed up. And I take this as a sign that there's a lot of confusion, perhaps, about what we should eat for our microbiome. Or maybe there's just a realization that both nutrition and the microbiome is important for health. And also the interaction between the microbiome and nutrition is important. So this talk is hosted by the company My Microbiome, and we are a hub for all things microbiome. And what we are most involved in at the moment is that we certify cosmetic products that are friendly towards the skin microbiome after having passed tests that we do on the products. So today's talk will be recorded, so if you can't stick around until the end or want to see the talk again, we will provide a link on LinkedIn later. And if you don't want to be seen in this recording, you can turn off your camera, but I don't think it's that dangerous to be seen here. I assume that you who have logged on for this presentation today come from a wide range of backgrounds and have very different knowledge level about the microbiome and biology and nutrition in general. So just to make sure that I don't lose a large share of you right off the bat in terms of understanding what I'm talking about, I first want to paint the big picture of our microbiome. So we harbor around 200 to 250 grams of microbes in our small intestine and large intestine. That number has been said earlier to be much larger, but the most updated number is around 200 to 250 grams. So this is commonly referred to as our gut microbiome or our human microbiome. And most will think about the microbes in the large intestine and not all the other microbes that we have on and in our body. But in reality, the human microbiome consists of all the microbes that live inside us and on us, on our skin, our nose, our lungs, in our ears, and so on. But for the purpose of this talk, I will stick to the gut microbiome, because this talk is about how diet can influence the microbiome, and the diet, of course, passes through our guts. And there is an obvious link between the gut microbiome and the diet, because the microbes need to eat just as you need to eat. So when you are eating, you are feeding your microbes too. And they don't only eat the food you eat directly, they can also eat the mucus you produce and a bit of other things that you secrete, but a large part of the microbes diet is your diet. So it makes total sense to me that if you feed your microbes the wrong stuff, they might misbehave, just like your body misbehaves if you don't get the right kind of nutrition. And one question therefore arises, is a bad diet to a large extent bad for your body because it affects your microbiome? In other words, that what we have thought were reasons for a bad diet giving health problems might not actually be the main reasons. Perhaps it is the wrong feeding of the microbiome that is the main reason. So the role the microbiome has in mediating the effects of diet is one main topic that I will get into today. And another important point about the big picture of the microbiome is that it's very diverse. It's a complex ecosystem. So when you eat a carrot, for instance, there will be different microbes that will digest, for instance, different parts of the carrot in a complex web of many thousand different types of bacteria and other microbes, where one microbe of bacteria and other microbes will prepare the meal for the next microbe, so to say, just like waiting in line in the canteen. Or microbes will eat different parts of the carrot, being picky eaters, just like some of us. Just a second. And if you have a low or a high level of some microbes, you may digest foods in a different way than others. And a clear example of that principle is how an average Japanese person digests seaweed. In fact, if you're not born and raised in Japan, you will probably digest less of the sushi you eat because of the way your microbes work. So people in Europe, for instance, who don't eat that much sushi and seaweed, we don't have microbes that can digest seaweed in any good manner. And in Japan, they eat much more seaweed in general, and so they have ended up having bacteria that can digest more of the seaweed. And the reason for that is that in the ocean, on the seaweed, bacteria live on that seaweed and digest parts of the seaweed, and they're kind of specialized on that. And when Japanese people eat seaweed, they also ingest some of the bacteria on the seaweed. And over time, some of these genes have actually jumped from these bacteria over to the bacteria that reside in the Japanese guts and have then been able to digest seaweed much better than us. So that's fascinating stuff, if you ask me. So in other words, we know that our microbiome to some extent can be changed by our diet, but how much can it be changed? And what do we know about the impact of our microbiome on our health and not just our gut health? Well, the microbiome has been linked to practically any chronic acquired disease on the planet. But linked does, of course, not necessarily mean that the microbiome causes or can prevent these diseases. For that, we need to do experiments. But these experiments have not really been done in humans for such a long time. In fact, this huge interest in the microbiome is less than 2 decades old. So if you find it hard to find good info on what to eat for a microbiome that goes beyond general dietary advice, the reason is, I would say, is that it's a very new field of research. But we do know something, and I will share some examples of the latest findings on this topic today. And a very clear example of a true causal factor of the microbiome in disease is this experiment I'm referring to here from 2006 that also sparked a lot of the recent interest, I would say, in the microbiome that I just mentioned. So what they did in this experiment was to transfer the gut microbiome bacteria, mostly from obese mice, and put that into lean mice. And nothing else changed. Their diet, how much they ran on the wheel, everything was the same in these mice, but the mice then turned obese anyhow. So the only difference was the transfer of bacteria and other microbes from obese mice, and then they ended up being obese. So this was a huge finding and really sparked a lot of research also in humans, but the picture isn't as clear in humans when it comes to obesity as with these mice, but there are some connections definitely. But is it so simple that we can talk about bad bugs and good bugs and that there's a defined healthy microbiome that we all should strive for? No, it's complicated, I'm sorry to say. So microbes are on a spectrum in terms of whether they will be more or less beneficial or harmful. And some microbes that might not do any harm at one stage might break bad and cause problems later on. And if you lack microbes that are highly associated with health, it doesn't necessarily mean anything at all, in part because you may have other microbes that replace the function of that microbe. Or, as I said, it can be just a correlation, and that the true cause of the relation to health is something completely different. But one take-home message is that the microbes can adapt to the environment you're in, so that for some people, one type of microbe composition will be the most conducive to good health for them, while another composition will be better for someone living elsewhere and eating something else. just as is seen with the Hadza people in Tanzania, who live as hunter-gatherers. They don't go to the supermarket to buy their foods. And what researchers have found is that these people who live very traditionally, they completely lack bifidobacteria, which is a central part of the gut and healthy people's gut in Western societies. But they're still very healthy. So that was a short intro to the microbiome, and now on to the diet microbiome interaction and some of the latest and also slightly older findings regarding what we should eat for our microbiome. And in order to try to find some answers to how diet affects your microbiome, we have to ask the right questions. And the increased understanding of the microbiome that we now have changes the way we must answer the question of what your diet is like. Because a regular answer may be that you eat lots of vegetables, a little bit of dairy, fish, and some meat, and lots of fruit, or that you're on a vegetarian diet, or that you eat a high-fat diet, or that you eat lots of carbohydrates. But describing the food groups or how much fats and carbohydrates you eat is, to me, not really anywhere near a full answer to the question. It leaves out something that potentially matters much more. Because most of the foods people eat are not the fish or the grains or the meat. People eat mostly food products. Actually, around 60% of the food items bought in the store in Western countries aren't only products that are somewhat changed from how they were delivered to us by nature, but they are so-called ultra-processed foods. The definition of what an ultra-processed food is kind of long, but for the purpose of this talk, the point is that we have a substantial portion of foods that are transformed into something quite far from what you would have eaten if you were a hunter-gatherer like the Hadza, where the only processing carried out is nothing more than the mental processing of today's hunt while you watch the pieces of giraffe and tubers being cooked on the fire. So if we are to understand anything near the full story of how foods affect our health through the microbiome, we need to factor in the processing of foods. And I will explain a bit more about that shortly. But for now, you can ponder how accessible the nutrients in, for instance, apple juice versus a whole apple are for your microbes. Do the microbes perceive the meal they are served differently if they are served chunks of an apple or free sugar from apple juice? And could that change the microbes' behavior? Okay, so we can agree, I hope, that we have to feed the microbes somehow. They do some important work for us. And seen from my perspective, a natural place to start figuring out what is good nutrition for our microbes is by looking at what foods, meals, and eating patterns that have kept us as humans healthy throughout the evolution of mankind. But what is the right kind of food for humans? Again, let's have a look at the big picture first. Are we supposed to eat mostly meat? That is, are we carnivores or are we true omnivores, meaning that we are thriving on anything really, except grass perhaps? Or could we be closer to being vegetarians more than anything else? Well, if we look at our guts, and there are good reasons to do so that I won't get into here, we lie somewhere between a pig and a dog. Even though human beings are called pigs sometimes, but don't do that. Pigs are clean, nice animals. And I would like to cite a doctor in Australia, Pran Yoganathan, who says or concludes that we are a carnivore capable of consuming an omnivore diet. So it doesn't say that it's optimal to be an omnivore, but that we're definitely suited to eat quite a lot of meat. But something else perhaps defines us better, I would say. We are cookivores. So when we started cooking our food, we were far from evolved into the species that is known as our current species, Homo sapiens. Cooking or heating our food is in fact part of the reason that we turned into the species that we are now, because cooking dramatically increases the availability of nutrients, the texture, toxin level in food, microbial contamination, and storage possibilities of foods. And this in turn favored the survival of those human-like beings that mastered cooking the best, and also the propagation of those genes, so to say. So if we buy into, just for a minute, that the fact that humans perhaps are adapted to eating mostly meat, but always have added some plant foods, what happens when someone decides to skip all plants altogether? I bet that some of you have heard of people nowadays who eat only animal foods, and I mean, no plants whatsoever. What happens to our microbiome then? Well, in a study, they looked at exactly that. The scientists here, they looked at what happened to the microbiome during and after a 5-day meat diet. And already after 24 hours, pretty large changes were already seen, and also after 5 days. But importantly, one couldn't really say that any of these changes were harmful. And then you may ask, don't you need fiber to feed your microbiome? There's no fiber in animal foods. So I do contend in this talk that if you want a healthy microbiome, you need to feed the microbes properly. And what is said a lot of times is that what's good for your microbiome is fiber. That's what's mostly left after the food we have eaten has passed through the small intestine, if you have an average Western diet. But there will be some leftovers from the meat you eat as well. And like I mentioned, the microbes can also eat mucus that you produce. But indeed, it's largely an unanswered question how the microbes do so well on a meat diet. But do bear in mind that this was only 5 days they were on this diet, so we don't really know what the long-term effects are. But there's a second question that arises when you cut out the fiber, because then there will be less short-chain fatty acids, which is good for the cells in the gut and beyond. So if it doesn't harm the microbiome, will it harm your cells? Well, if you do what they did in the mentioned study just now, you are actually on a ketogenic diet, which means that you eat so little carbs that you will start producing ketones from the fats you eat and from the stored fat in your body. That is important to understand the effect on our cells and on our health. Because it turns out that these beneficial short-chain fatty acids can be substituted by the ketones that are produced when you are on a ketogenic diet, because short-chain fatty acids are converted into ketones before they are used as energy and other things for the colon cells. So it doesn't really matter much where the ketones come from, be it the fiber or the fat conversion products from the absorbed or stored fat in your body. Okay, I'm changing gears a little bit. It's time to get practical. And I suppose that is what many of you are here for. You just want to tell me what to eat, you might say. So I will give you 7 tips for what you should consider when it comes to your diet or other people's diets. So the amount of studies that have been carried out are quite few on this topic. So what I mentioned in the next slides is mostly the only studies that have been carried out on the foods that I mentioned, also the indications or the things that they do affect in our body. So I would say that these studies are not really cherry-picked by me. So tip number 1. Eat enough of your greens, eat enough polyphenols. Polyphenols, those are the things that we used to call antioxidants. I mean, they still have antioxidant properties, but it doesn't seem like that's the most important thing about them. So the latest study on what happens to our microbiome and our gut health when you increase the amount of things such as cocoa, green tea, and berries is the one I am referring to here. What they saw in the study were some favorable changes in the intestinal permeability. You might have heard of a leaky gut, and that's what I'm meaning by intestinal permeability. Some markers for that were improved, and there was also an improvement in the fecal microbiome. And there have been carried out several other studies as well on different kinds of berries and other plants. And in general, you can see some beneficial effects. And I will not get into detail about the role of the background diet in these studies, but I will just say that in general, it is not super clear always whether the changes in the microbiome truly is something that mediates the effects of the diet changes in health markers. So this has to be investigated more. So tip number 2, eat more of specific greens or polyphenols. So through a number of studies that I'm not mentioning here, some of these plant substances that you can find in grapefruit and in parsley have been identified as having more promising properties than others. And so 2 of these substances are naringenin and apigenin, and they're quite similar, so I treat them as the same. And the first clinical trial in humans that shows weight loss with supplementation of naringenin is this one that I'm referring to here. And the relation to the microbiome is that in obese mice, at least, the microbes residing in the gut there, they do a pretty good job of degrading naringenin and apigenin. And this is not good, actually, because naringenin has some positive effects on the regulation of body weight in mice and also in humans, at least if we believe this study that I'm referring to here. So we don't know if humans lack these or have these microbes that can degrade too much of the naringenin and apigenin. But if you are obese, I think it's probable that you could use some more naringenin than other people. Okay, next tip, tip 3. Limit the intake of certain food additives. Basically, none of these additives are tested on the microbiome before approval. So, 20 years ago or longer ago, we didn't really know that the microbiome was important. And so the authorities are lagging behind in understanding this, and they still haven't really gotten around to testing the additives on the microbiome. But independent researchers have found that some additives have detrimental effects on the microbiome and also on health, gut health. And in mice, for instance, the emulsifiers like carboxymethyl cellulose has been shown to change the microbiome, lead to more inflammation, and you want to see the starting phases of inflammatory bowel syndrome or a disease with these emulsifiers in doses that are relevant for humans. And these emulsifiers can be found in ice cream, for instance. And there are also pesticides in non-organic foods, at least, that can also change the microbiome, but there's quite a little research in that realm. So tip number 4 out of 7, eat more fermented foods. And up until recently, there weren't that many studies on this topic, but last year, one new study came that was really well done. And but first, let's say that you don't have the right kind of microbes in your gut, and no matter how healthy you eat, the wrong kind of microbes will thrive all too well on that food. What can you do? Well, you can add probiotics, but that's a different topic. But you can also eat foods that have been pre-treated, so to say, with microbes. And many of these microbes will be dead before they get in touch with your mouth, let alone your gut. But that doesn't mean that the microbe's job is wasted. After all, also the microbes in our gut affect us not just by being there and taking up space, but because of the substances that they produce and secrete and the structure of the microbes themselves. And when you let those microbes eat your food first, in part, before you eat them, you have kind of fast forwarded some of the things that would have happened in your gut anyway. Or perhaps if you do not have such a healthy microbiome, it could be even better than if you ingested the food in the unfermented state. So the results you see here are essentially all the studies that I have found on each food and the given health marker. So first off, kefir. In this study I'm referring to here that you can find on PubMed, an improvement in intestinal barrier function was seen. And in another study, fermented cheese, which you could separate from a non-fermented cheese, was then able to reduce inflammation overall in the body. And the study that I mentioned, fermented foods in general, seem to reduce inflammation and improve the diversity of the fecal microbiome. And diversity is something that is regarded generally as good, at least in the gut microbiome, that you have lots of different microbes and that they're kind of, you don't have too much of one bacterium and too little of another. And then kimchi, the Korean food, has been shown in 2 studies to improve glucose tolerance, which means that you can kind of revert the trajectory towards diabetes, at least for the duration of the study that I'm referring to here, and also reduced body weight in another study. And then as a dietitian, I shouldn't talk too much about alcohol, I guess, and say that it's good, but that's why I want to highlight that also non-alcoholic beer can be good for women in menopause, that can reduce menopausal symptoms. And the reason for that seems to be the hops that is used in beer production that have some estrogenic like effects. Tip number 5, eat more spermidine-rich foods. And spermidine is a substance found in several fermented foods and in wheat germ. So in one study, spermidine improved gut barrier integrity and gut microbiota function in obese mice, not in humans this time. And in another study, spermidine affected cardiac function by influencing the gut microbiota. And the spermidine is really an interesting subject or a substance, which I will not get into that much here, but it seems to affect aging processes in the body and basically works on a very fundamental level in our cells to kind of rejuvenate the cells. So tip number 6, eat mostly whole foods and don't eat too often, which is kind of contrary to what we have been told during the last decades. You should eat often, but I don't think so. And this has to do with nutrient accessibility, nutrient density. And now we're back to the apples and the apple juice that I mentioned earlier on. And what one has seen is that if you subject microbes, bacteria, to lots of nutrients, pure sugar, they will start to misbehave. They will start to be more virulent. They will start to be more aggressive, one could say. So what I imagine happens is that if you eat an apple, you will swallow chunks of the apple, and the sugar in the apple will still be mostly within the cells of the apple, and they will slowly be released during the transit in the small intestine. And so the sugar isn't that concentrated really for the microbes. The microbes can only see what they kind of can touch that's closest to them. So while you see, as a human being, you see an apple, oh, that's juicy, that contains probably a lot of energy, and it's kind of the same as apple juice. But for the microbe, when you drink apple juice, they will swim in sugar, but it doesn't really happen when you eat chunks of an apple. So this could lead to inflammation in the gut, is what I believe, and others also believe, and effects further on in the body. And I've written a bit about this in this article that you can access freely you can just Google and get into more of what I'm writing there. So, sorry, the final tip, mix it up a little. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll get into that, but what I'm saying here is that there is not so much concrete evidence that I have for what is stated on this slide. But what I am saying is that if your nutrition is too one-sided, that may lead to one or a few microbes thriving all too good on a specific food. And maybe these microbes get too much of an upper hand and will disturb the balance of the ecosystem. And if you're unlucky, maybe you have some microbes from before that are kind of not that good, and then you'll actually end up feeding them more. That could perhaps not be all that beneficial. So perhaps you should fast for a few days, a few times per year. Maybe that can surprise some of the bad bugs in your gut. And maybe you should eat according to the seasons. Eat the fresh food and local food that's around you. That's also good for the planet, I would say. And maybe you should eat little animal products for a while and then more or much more. But I would not, I would really advise against just eating animal foods for a long time, because we don't really know what can happen down the line if you do that. Or maybe you should eat lots of greens for a while and then less and then more and so on. So with that, I am ready to take questions. And I know that my colleague, Hedy, she has probably some questions. At least I can't see the questions.
Thanks a lot, Inge. So at the moment, there are no questions, any questions yet. So maybe you just can type it in, or would you like to, or maybe I can say.
Yeah.
Or now you can talk if you want to.
It doesn't, yeah, now she can talk, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, there's no chat function. I was looking at the chat function in between and there was none, so I could not write down any questions. At least I didn't find the chat function, but I have memorized my questions, so no worries. Thanks a lot, Inge, for the interesting some interesting insights. I've also already read quite a few things about it, so not too much news for me, but nothing contradictory. My question was just, I don't eat any meat at all. How bad is that?
I think that I can't really say that that's bad for your microbiome at all. So it's more about what nutrients are you getting, and if you have, if you take supplements or you know what you're doing, I mean that could be perfectly okay. And if you feel okay as well, I really can't say that that's a bad thing. But in general, for women at least, and people who don't really know that much about what they're doing, meat can be a really good to eat a bit of, at least a few times a week, because it's so nutrient dense, and you find nutrients there that you won't find that much of in other foods. Of course, if you don't eat fish or eggs or anything else, then meat can be a really important and really super food.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Petra, I don't know if she's able to unmute.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for your speech. I would like to ask a question with regards to number 6, your number 6 tip. You were saying that rather eat whole food than processed food, or and my question is, we are being told, or at least I'm trying to tell my kids, they should chew their food and not just swallow. It's they are teenagers and they tend to eat very fast because they have more important things to do. And of course, I'm of the opinion that one should chew in order for the body to take up nutrients better. But you're saying it's better to let small chunks go down into the intestine and be food for the microbes. Are you saying that we should chew less than we do?
I'm really glad that question, because it's kind of a new concept for many, and it's not really clear in any regard what are we actually talking about here. When does the processing turn into something that's not good, and what is okay? But basically, I'm talking about the industrial processing, like really crushing the food up front before you eat it. So when you if you chew 5 times or 20 times the food that you eat, it doesn't appear to change it all that much. Actually, I had a student that I was supervising just a year ago, and you can find her master's thesis if you want. It's in English, yeah. So and then you can find more details on it. It's not published yet. So chewing changes it a bit, but not at all much. So if you chew it for 30 seconds or for 5 seconds, it's not that big a difference. And I would also like to add that it's an hypothesis, and but what we do know is that ultra processed foods in general, be it the additives or that you can eat ultra processed foods faster and that therefore you can eat more in one go. It's easier to overeat in a meal. There could be lots of different reasons for ultra processed foods being implicated in obesity, and to me it seems really clear that if you eat the typical ultra processed foods, that will increase the obesity level on average in people. Yeah. So I would really tell, or you can tell your kids still, that calm down. It's not good to stress while you eat, and they might tolerate that now when they're young, but suddenly they might run into problems, and that might be because they're stressing or running around when they're eating. Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
So there's another question by Liz.
There is another question?
Yes.
Hi there. Yeah, this is Liz. I have a question. Do you know whether or not there are more intentional and larger groups of scientists focusing on the relationship between your microbiome and Crohn's disease? And sort of a side part question to that is, people with Crohn's disease, are they typically associated with a pretty high leaky gut? And if so, is that all potentially reversible? So it's sort of 2 questions in one. Sorry.
Yeah, you can just ask me again if I don't answer both of them, and if I don't understood the question. So there's definitely people with Crohn's disease have a different microbiome. That's for sure. And when it comes to diet and Crohn's disease, there really hasn't been done much research at all. So maybe there's research that I haven't been able to find, but I don't think that I have, or that anybody has any good answer to your question. But maybe you had, there was parts of the question that you can ask again if I didn't really answer.
Yeah, the other part was, so intuitively, it makes sense to me, right, that we should start sending more attention into the gut microbiome of Crohn's patients. But my thought also is intuitively, do we know if those folks suffer with a higher degree of leaky gut and contributing to that systemic inflammation of that autoimmune process?
I can't recall a specific study, but it's just my general perception, yes, that they do have a more leaky gut. And also what I mentioned earlier with these emulsifiers, I mean, what you saw in these mice when they ingested emulsifiers, they saw clear indications that they were on the verge of getting inflammatory bowel disease. So I mean, we do know something. But I will look a bit more into that, and perhaps I'll write something about that on our website and get more into it. But have you looked into some of the research yourself, or do you have or do you know something that you could perhaps share?
I have been digging and digging and digging, and I'm finding a very scarcity of information, and most of it is anecdotal. But I feel like if there could be more effort in this area, we could probably get them off chemotherapy and just clean up that gut. Who knows? But thank you for your willingness to take a look at it with your brain.
Yeah. No, and for sure, there's going to come more research in the future on this, and then there are some indications in animal studies, and I'm sure that there are more things or more things to kind of theorize or hypothesize about what might be good for people with Crohn's disease.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, the next question goes to Diana Kusuma.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It's very short and interesting. I have heard many times that for, let's say, the athletes that really do triathlons and all with the intense exercise, the intense exercise actually may have influence in the microbiome. And do you have any tips and tricks how to, like maintain the microbiome to be, stay healthy, or what is your opinion on that?
Well, that's also something that hasn't been researched that much. There are some correlations in people. You see that athletes have a different microbiome than other athletes. People who do endurance exercise have different microbiome than those who do strength exercise. And they do also, after the exercise, they have more of a leaky gut, at least short term. Whether that really has something to say if you're healthy otherwise, I don't think that's really concluded that actually is a problem. And I do also know, but your question was about staying healthy as an athlete, or?
Yeah, more of how to make sure that the microbiome is still okay. But I also don't know what is the okay or the healthy state for these people actually.
No, and that's, I mean, there were a lot of correlations, and also, so when you do a lot of exercise, you will produce more lactic acid, and that can also end up in the gut, and therefore you can have more microbes that like to eat lactic acid. So that's like, with the Hadza people that I mentioned, that's one way that the microbiome adapts. So what is a good microbiome for an athlete might not be good for another person. So, but I do also know that there are some probiotics that actually are tailored to athletes, but that's in terms of improving the performance. At least that's the idea. I don't know if that supplement is accessible in Europe or elsewhere already, but there have been studies on that it actually can affect the endurance, but I haven't looked at the details, and there's not more than one study, so we have to wait and see. But you know, that's the theme of a lot of these things, that it's really not that well researched, and so the microbiome, there's a lot of research on the microbiome in general, but when it comes to the microbiome and diet, I mean, there's not much, and the studies that have been conducted is like they are on the diet and microbiome. It's pretty superficial sometimes, and sometimes they don't factor in the processing of the foods, like what kind of fats were there. It's just high fat or low fat, and that's all they test, and that could be totally different from study to study.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So next question goes to Sandra Kuhn.
Yeah, thank you. Me again. Just have another small question. You know, you can also buy bionic supplements in the market. What do you think of that? You know, the little pills you can swallow that are loaded with millions and millions of micro whatever.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I would say that definitely there are studies on different strains. You have to be very specific with the strains, and that have shown an improvement in health when you take these supplements. So there are definitely some supplements out there, but we actually did a survey on the supplements that you can find just by Googling that, and a large part of the probiotics, they don't fulfill basic quality criteria. So you really have to seek out those that are have some good solid science behind them, and that's not easy to do. So, but we in My Microbiome, we hope to make that easier with the seal that we have or are going to launch more broadly soon. So, but there are, you know, there are very specific strains that can affect obesity, for instance, and IBS, and so definitely. But it's really hard to say which strains and which products are the best.
Okay, thanks.
So, Vladimir.
Hi. It was really nice talk. I just want to go back to the Liz family question about the Crohn's disease. Actually, there are a few companies that I know that are actually active in the field of looking for the therapies for the Crohn's disease. And if she would like, she can go to my website because actually our company is also active in the microbiome field. It's called Microbiome-friendly.com, and you can just check there, contact me or contact me on the LinkedIn, and then we can discuss the topic maybe in more details. I can send you a few links if you like.
That's very helpful. So yeah, I would like to look more into that. So do send me that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Diana again.
Could you repeat the website one more time?
It's Microbiome Power. It's one word. Microbiomepower.com.
Thank you.
So this is really good. That's also what we try to do at My Microbiome, is to get people to meet and exchange knowledge. So it's really good when it can be interactive like it is now. So I really appreciate the questions and the exchange of information. So, but I see that we have now passed the time that we have set for today. I don't know, Hedy, do you think that we should? I can take my questions, but
yeah, but there are no more questions left at the moment. No.
Okay, so with that, I would like to say thank you to all of you that showed up, and I think we can promise that we will do this again later sometime and kind of really delve more into some more details later on. So we'll keep you informed about that on LinkedIn and elsewhere. So I don't know if you have anything else to add, Hedy, or if we should just say thank you to all.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your attention. So we're going to send out the recording via LinkedIn. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.